David smoothed his tie one last time, checking his reflection in the car window. After years of putting Rachel through college and writing checks for this lavish wedding, his chest swelled with a father's pride. Though their relationship had grown strained, surely today would heal old wounds. At the venue entrance, a security guard stepped forward. "Sir, I need to see your invitation." David reached for his wallet. "Of course, I'm the bride's father." The guard's expression hardened as he pulled out a photograph. David's face circled in red, "Do not admit," stamped across the bottom. "I'm sorry, sir. I have orders not to let you in." "There must be some mistake," David whispered, his voice failing him. The guard shook his head. The bride and her mother were very specific. The betrayal landed like a physical blow. David had paid for everything, but couldn't witness his daughter's vows. "Thank you for approving the opening hook. I'll now create Chapter 1 according to your detailed specifications." David adjusted his boutonniere in the mirror, fingers working with practiced precision despite their slight tremor. The pale pink rose matched the wedding color scheme Rachel had carefully described during one of their infrequent calls. He'd written checks for everything, from the 5-tier cake to the string quartet, yet found himself reviewing the wedding schedule again, uncertain of his exact role in the ceremony. The small velvet box on his dresser contained his gift, a pendant that had belonged to his mother, reset with a diamond from his late wife's engagement ring. 3 generations of love combined for Rachel. He traced the inscription on the back. "Family is forever." 17 years ago, he had signed the adoption papers, promising to love Rachel as his own. He'd kept that promise through private school tuition, summers abroad, the finest education money could provide. If their relationship had grown distant these past few years, surely today would bridge that gap. His phone buzzed. The car service had arrived. David pocketed the gift, straightened his tie, and took a deep breath. Something in his chest tightened as he glanced at the wedding invitation. Rachel had addressed it simply to David, not Dad. Minor detail, he told himself. Today was about new beginnings. The venue was transformed into a spring garden, just as Rachel had wanted. White chairs lined with ribbon awaited guests, many already filling with familiar faces. David nodded to acquaintances as he approached the entrance, confidence returning. He belonged here. "Excuse me, sir." A young man in a security uniform stepped into his path. "May I see your invitation?" David smiled, reaching for his wallet. "Of course, I'm the father of the bride." The guard's expression shifted subtly as he compared David to a photograph in his hand. "I'm sorry, sir. I can't let you in." "There must be some mistake." David leaned forward, catching sight of his own face in the photo, circled in red marker. The words, "Do not admit," were printed boldly across the bottom. "The bride and her mother were very clear, sir." The guard looked uncomfortable but resolute. "Your name is on our restricted list." "This is absurd," David said, voice low but firm. "I paid for this entire wedding. Rachel is my daughter." A few guests turned to look. Heat rose in David's face, not anger, but the flush of public humiliation. "I need to speak with Rachel," he insisted. "I have instructions to call police if you don't leave," the guard replied, hand moving to his radio. The realization settled over David like ice water. This was no mistake, no miscommunication. He had been deliberately excluded from the celebration he had funded. His chest constricted as he backed away, dignity crumbling under curious stares. "Is everything okay?" asked an elderly woman nearby. David couldn't answer. The betrayal had stolen his voice. In his car, parked where he could see the venue entrance, David's hand shook as he dialed Rachel's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, then sent a text. "There seems to be a misunderstanding at the door. Please call me." The minutes ticked by. Inside, his daughter would be preparing for her walk down the aisle, a walk he had assumed would be on his arm. He called Emily, Rachel's mother, though they rarely spoke since the divorce. Voicemail again. Not a coincidence. Through the windshield, David watched guests streaming in, laughing, unaware of his exile. He tried Rachel's maid of honor, then her fiancé. No answers. Then a response from Rachel. "This is my day. Please respect my wishes and leave." The coldness of it staggered him. 17 years of bedtime stories, swimming lessons, college visits, reduced to this dismissal. David opened his glove compartment, pulled out the wedding invitation he'd saved, and placed it beside the security guard's photograph someone had slipped him. The juxtaposition told its own story: invited to pay, forbidden to attend. He started the engine, the soft purr a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. As he pulled away, the wedding gift sat heavy in his pocket, its promise of forever now a cruel joke against the reality of his daughter's rejection. David drove slowly, a man suddenly without destination, without purpose, trying to reconcile the daughter he thought he knew with the woman who had orchestrated his public humiliation. Thank you for approving Chapter 1. I'll now create Chapter 2 according to your specifications. 3 days after the wedding, David sat at his desk, surrounded by the remnants of attempts to reach Rachel. His phone displayed a log of unanswered calls, 12 to Rachel, 7 to Emily, 4 to various wedding party members. Each represented an hour of hope followed by crushing disappointment. "Rachel, it's Dad again. Please call me. I just want to understand." He hung up and rubbed his eyes. The wedding announcement in the local paper lay beside him. Emily Walker proudly announces the marriage of her daughter, Rachel Walker. No mention of him as the adoptive father who had raised her since she was 6. His phone chimed. "Rachel, finally. I can't talk now. We're about to leave for our honeymoon. Rachel, please. I just need to know why I wasn't allowed at the wedding." "After everything, it was just easier this way," she interrupted. "Mom thought it would be less complicated." "Less complicated. I paid for the entire wedding." A pause. "And we're grateful. But it's done now, so can we just move on?" The casual dismissal staggered him. "I've been a father to you for 17 years. David, you're making this bigger than it needs to be. I have to go." The line went dead. He stared at the phone, hearing for the first time how she'd addressed him, not Dad, but David. When had that changed? And how had he missed it? The laptop screen glowed in the darkening room, displaying Rachel's social media posts. Joyful wedding photos, already gathering hundreds of likes. He was erased from the narrative, invisible despite his contributions. The father who existed only through his checkbook. The next morning, David met Margaret for coffee. As Rachel's godmother and Emily's former best friend, she might have insights he lacked. "I was surprised not to see you at the wedding," Margaret said, stirring her coffee. "Thought maybe you were ill." "I wasn't invited," David said quietly. "Security turned me away at the door." Margaret's spoon clattered against her cup. "What? That's impossible. You paid for everything." "Apparently my financial contributions were welcome, but I wasn't." Her expression shifted from shock to something like recognition. "Emily's handiwork," she said finally. "I've seen this pattern before." David leaned forward. "What pattern?" "After you adopted Rachel, Emily was furious you formed such a strong bond with her. Remember when Rachel wanted to hyphenate her last name to include yours? Emily was livid. The memory surfaced. Rachel at 12, proudly announcing her desire to be Rachel Walker Matthews. The subsequent arguments. How she'd eventually dropped the idea. Emily's been poisoning that well for years, Margaret continued, her voice gentler than her words. I've heard her tell Rachel that your financial support was just guilt money because you weren't her real father. David's hands tightened around his cup. Rachel was 6 when I adopted her. I taught her to ride a bike. I sat through every dance recital. I know. Margaret placed a weathered photo on the table. Rachel's 10th birthday. David helping her blow out candles, their faces alight with shared joy. This was before Emily started her campaign in earnest. Look at Rachel's eyes when she looked at you then. The contrast between that adoring gaze and Rachel's cold text messages was stark. Years of subtle undermining had rewritten their history, transformed a loving father into a mere financial resource. Emily always resented that you moved on after the divorce, Margaret added, having you pay for everything while excluding you. That's her version of justice. That evening, David spread financial records across his desk. Tuition payments, extracurricular activities, the trust fund established when Rachel was 8. The numbers told a story of consistent generosity. Private school, summer programs abroad, college without student loans, a luxury wedding, and a substantial trust that would mature when Rachel turned 30. He'd never kept a ledger of his giving. Love wasn't calculated that way. Yet seeing the evidence of his financial commitment alongside Rachel's easy dismissal left him with questions he'd never before considered. Had his generosity enabled entitlement? Had providing everything she wanted prevented her from valuing what truly mattered? David opened the trust document, scanning for something he vaguely remembered. There, on page 17, the clause his attorney had insisted upon. In the event of intentional harm, emotional cruelty, or deliberate estrangement perpetrated by the beneficiary against the grantor, the trust may be frozen or redirected at the grantor's discretion. At the time, he'd thought the provision unnecessary, even offensive. Who would anticipate needing protection from their own child? He picked up Rachel's wedding invitation again. Below it sat the security guard's photo of him marked, "Do not admit." The juxtaposition was damning evidence of intentional harm, a deliberate public humiliation. The trust fund contained enough to purchase a comfortable first home, seed a business, or provide financial security for years. Rachel and her new husband were counting on it. They'd already put a deposit on a house that required trust fund access to complete the purchase. For 17 years, David had given without expectation of return. The clause offered a boundary he'd never thought he'd enforce, a way to say that some betrayals carried consequences. His finger traced the legal language that suddenly felt like a lifeline to his dignity. Love might be unconditional, but perhaps respect shouldn't be. The realization settled in his chest, uncomfortable yet clarifying. Sometimes the price of giving was learning when to stop. Thank you for approving Chapter 2. I'll now create Chapter 3 according to your specifications. The law offices of Harrington and Associates occupied the 10th floor of a downtown high-rise, all polished mahogany and leather-bound books. David sat across from Eleanor Harrington, who had managed his legal affairs for 15 years. I need to understand my options regarding Rachel's trust fund, David said, sliding the document across her desk. Specifically, this clause about intentional harm or estrangement. Eleanor adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the passage. Yes, I remember insisting on this provision. Standard protection for grantors. Her clinical tone contrasted with the emotional weight David carried. What's happened? David explained the wedding exclusion, showing her the security photo and Rachel's dismissive messages. Eleanor's professional demeanor remained intact, but her eyes registered shock. Legally, you have clear grounds to invoke the clause, she said. The evidence of deliberate exclusion and subsequent dismissal constitutes emotional cruelty under the terms. And what happens if I do? The trust assets remain intact but frozen. Rachel can't access them until the situation is resolved, or you decide otherwise. You could also redirect the assets to charity, another family member, or a new trust with modified conditions. David nodded slowly. And the house they're trying to buy? They'd lose their deposit if they can't secure alternate financing. Eleanor removed her glasses. David, my legal advice is straightforward, but I need to ask, are you prepared for the relational fallout? This isn't just a financial decision. I know. The weight of potential consequences sat heavy in his chest. But if I do nothing, aren't I teaching Rachel that treating people cruelly has no consequences? That's beyond my legal expertise, Eleanor said, but her slight nod acknowledged the truth in his words. I need time to consider this, David said. Of course. Eleanor gathered the documents. When you decide, we can implement immediately. David stood, feeling both the burden and the strange power of having options. For the first time since the wedding, he wasn't simply reacting to betrayal. He was considering how to respond. David sat in his study that evening, the trust documents spread before him. Through the window, he watched the maple in his backyard sway in the breeze, the tree where he'd built Rachel a swing when she was 7. He picked up a framed photo from his desk. Rachel at her high school graduation, his arm around her shoulders, her smile genuine. That was before Emily's influence had fully taken hold, before Dad had become David. The contrast between that moment and the wedding exclusion illustrated everything he'd lost. He reached for his phone, wondering if he should try Rachel one more time. Give her a chance to explain, to apologize, but the memory of her casual dismissal stopped him. You're making this bigger than it needs to be. As if 17 years of fatherhood could be erased without consequence. The trust document seemed to pulse with possibility. This wasn't about punishment. It was about boundaries. About saying that love didn't mean accepting mistreatment. About valuing himself enough to establish consequences for cruelty. David picked up his pen. The decision crystallized not in anger, but in clarity. He signed where Eleanor had marked, authorizing the freeze on Rachel's trust. His hand was steady, his resolve firm. He sealed the document in an envelope for courier delivery to Eleanor's office in the morning. Then he walked to his front door and changed the locks, another boundary, small but significant. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. The door to his heart and home would no longer be open automatically. Access would need to be earned through respect. Back in his study, David poured himself a small measure of scotch. There was no satisfaction in what he'd done, only a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes love required standing firm. Not to hurt, but to heal. Not from vengeance, but from self-respect. He raised his glass to the graduation photo. I still love you, Rachel, he whispered, but I deserve better than this. A week after freezing the trust, David found himself scrolling through social media before bed, a habit he'd developed to feel connected to Rachel's life from a distance. Usually, he saw only carefully curated honeymoon photos from Greece. Tonight was different. A mutual friend had tagged Rachel in a post from the wedding reception. David's finger hovered over the image, knowing he should scroll past. Instead, he clicked. The post showed Rachel and 3 bridesmaids, champagne glasses raised. The caption stunned him. "When the ATM isn't invited to the wedding, but still funds the open bar. Hashtag daddy's money. No problems. Hash cash cows on the move." Comments followed, including Rachel's. "OMG, stop." But for real, he's probably sitting home calculating how many father-daughter dances he's owed for the down payment on our house. David stared at the screen, the blue light harsh in his darkened bedroom. The mockery was casual, public, shared with hundreds of mutual connections who would recognize the reference to him. The deliberate misspelling of move as move to emphasize the cash cow metaphor was particularly cutting. His chest tightened. This wasn't just exclusion, it was ridicule. The daughter he'd raised saw him not as a father, but as an ATM, worth keeping around for financial support, but not for his presence or love. He closed the app and set his phone face down, the screen's glow disappearing into darkness. The silence of his empty house pressed in around him. For 17 years, he had poured himself into being a father, coaching soccer teams, helping with homework, celebrating victories, comforting through disappointments. Had it all been reduced to this? A wallet with legs. The phone rang, startling him. An unknown number, nearly midnight, too late for business calls, too early for emergencies. "Hello?" David answered, voice rough with emotion. "Is this David Matthews?" A man's voice, unfamiliar but determined. "Yes. Who's calling?" "My name is James Harrison. I'm Rachel's father-in-law. We need to talk about what happened at the wedding." David sat up straighter, a mixture of wariness and curiosity replacing his despair. "I'm listening. Thank you for approving Chapter 3. I'll now create Chapter 4 according to your specifications." David gripped the phone tighter, his darkened living room suddenly feeling smaller. "What exactly do you want to discuss about the wedding, Mr. Harrison?" "Please call me James." The voice on the phone carried a directness David had almost forgotten in his interactions with Rachel and Emily. "I need you to know I had no idea they planned to exclude you until it was happening." What they did was wrong. David sank into his armchair, unprepared for this stranger's moral clarity. "How did you find out?" "I overheard Emily gloating to my wife about how they'd managed to keep you away while still using your money." James's disgust was palpable. "She was showing off that photo they gave security, your picture with 'Do Not Admit' written across it, laughing about it." The image of Emily taking pleasure in his humiliation reopened a wound David thought had begun to heal. "I see." "I confronted her immediately, demanded to know if Michael, my son, was aware of this scheme. He claimed ignorance, but I'm not sure I believe him." "Rachel would have told him," David said quietly. "They don't keep secrets from each other." "That's what I feared." James paused. "I want to apologize on behalf of my family's involvement, however unwitting. What happened to you was cruel and undeserved." No father should be treated that way, especially one who raised and supported Rachel as you did. The validation from this stranger was both soothing and disorienting. For weeks, David had questioned whether his hurt was justified or if, as Rachel had suggested, he was making this bigger than it needed to be. "I appreciate your call, James," David managed, his voice rougher than intended. "But I'm curious why you're reaching out now, weeks later." "Because I've seen how they're proceeding as if nothing happened. And then today, I heard about the trust fund freeze. I thought you deserved to know what really occurred at the wedding." David leaned forward. "What do you mean, what really occurred?" "The wedding didn't exactly go as planned after I confronted Emily," James said. "There's more to the story. When I realized what Emily and Rachel had done," James continued, "I couldn't just stand by. The ceremony was about to start. Guests were seated, music playing. Michael and the minister were at the altar." David closed his eyes, picturing the scene he'd been excluded from. "I pulled Emily aside, but she was dismissive, said you were just the adoptive father, and that Rachel wanted her real family at the wedding." James's voice tightened. "I told her that was absurd. You raised Rachel. You were her father in every way that mattered. Emily has always—" David began, then stopped. How could he explain the years of subtle undermining to a stranger? She refused to reconsider, so I made a decision. James's tone became firmer. When the minister asked if anyone objected to the union, I stood up. David's breath caught. "You stopped the wedding?" "I did. I said I couldn't in good conscience witness a marriage that began with such a fundamental dishonesty. That my son needed to know his bride had deliberately excluded her father after accepting his financial support." The image of James rising in protest before the assembled guests, standing up for a man he'd never met, was almost impossible to process. "There was chaos," James continued. "Emily screamed at me. Rachel broke down crying. Michael looked shell-shocked. Half the guests had no idea what was happening. The other half were whispering about the missing father." "What happened next?" David asked, torn between vindication and a deeper sadness. "The ceremony was postponed, not canceled. They did marry 2 days later, privately. But that moment of public reckoning—" James paused. "Rachel had to face what she'd done. For a brief moment I saw genuine shame in her eyes." David rubbed his forehead, trying to absorb this revelation. A stranger had defended his honor while his own daughter had betrayed him. The irony wasn't lost on him. "Why would you do that for someone you'd never met?" David asked finally. "Because it was right," James answered simply. "And because I'd want someone to do the same for me. Fatherhood is sacred. It shouldn't be discarded for convenience." As the conversation wound down, David found himself unexpectedly grateful for this moral clarity from a stranger, and simultaneously devastated by its necessity. After hanging up, David sat motionless in the dark. The house's silence pressed against him like a physical weight. James's revelations had answered questions, but opened deeper wounds. He rose finally, moving through the house like a sleepwalker. In the hallway, family photographs chronicled Rachel's growth from gap-toothed child to college graduate. Each frame represented not just a milestone, but an investment of his heart. In her bedroom, preserved since she'd left for college, cheerleading trophies and honor roll certificates covered the shelves. He'd attended every competition, every ceremony. Who was he if not the father who had cheered from the sidelines, helped with science projects, taught her to drive? "You were just the adoptive father," Emily had said. Just as if the 17 years of daily love and sacrifice could be dismissed with a single word. David touched the faded height marks on the doorframe, each line carefully dated in his handwriting. He'd measured Rachel's growth, celebrated each inch gained. Who had measured his growth as a father? Who celebrated the man he'd become through raising her? In his study, he found himself opening the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside lay greeting cards from years past, handmade Father's Day creations with wobbly letters declaring him world's best dad, birthday cards signed with "Love you forever," Christmas notes thanking him for making everything special. When had those genuine sentiments transformed into calculation? Had they ever been real? "Who am I now?" he whispered to the empty house. without the identity of Rachel's father, an identity he'd worn proudly for 17 years. What remained? He'd structured his life, his decisions, his very self-concept around being her dad. The foundation upon which he'd built his identity had crumbled. The future he'd imagined, walking Rachel down the aisle, bouncing grandchildren on his knee, family holidays, and shared milestones, had vanished. The narrative of his life now contained a painful gap where those chapters should have been. He returned to his bedroom and stood before the mirror, studying the face that looked back at him, the same face that had been circled in red, labeled "Do Not Admit." The same man, but fundamentally altered by rejection. If not her father, he asked his reflection, then who? The question lingered, unanswered. But somewhere beneath the devastation, a small voice whispered that perhaps the answer lay not in what he had lost, but in what he might still create. Thank you for approving Chapter 4. I'll now create Chapter 5 according to your specifications. David sat across from Walter at their usual corner table at Riverside Cafe. Sunlight streamed through the windows, a welcome change after days of introspection in his darkened home. At 72, Walter carried himself with a quiet dignity that David had always admired, even more so now that he knew Walter's story. "I've been worried about you," Walter said, stirring his coffee. "You've missed our chess matches 3 weeks running." David sighed. "It's been a difficult time. Margaret told me about the wedding, and Rachel." Walter's directness was refreshing after weeks of evasion from his daughter. "I've spent my entire adult life being Rachel's father," David said. "Now I don't know who I am anymore." Walter nodded slowly. "I understand more than you might think. My son hasn't spoken to me in 15 years. David looked up, surprised. Walter had mentioned a son in passing, but never elaborated. After the divorce, his mother poisoned him against me. By the time he reached adulthood, he'd decided I was the villain in their story. Walter's eyes held old pain, but his voice remained steady. I spent 5 years trying to fix it. Endless calls, letters, gifts, begging for a relationship. What changed? I did. Walter set down his spoon. I realized I was defining myself solely as rejected father. Every thought, every action revolved around that wound. I was letting his absence determine my presence in the world. David felt a flicker of recognition. How did you move past it? I stopped waiting for him to validate my worth, started building a life that wasn't centered on his absence. Walter leaned forward. The question isn't whether Rachel sees you as her father. The question is who you choose to be in response to her rejection. I'm not sure I know how to be anything else, David admitted. That's the opportunity in this pain, Walter said. When someone rejects the role we've built our identity around, we get to discover who we are beyond that role. There's freedom in that, once you move through the grief. David studied his friend's face. The serenity that had always seemed natural, now revealed as hard-won. Does it still hurt? Yes, Walter said simply, but it no longer defines me. The pain became part of my story, not the whole story. The words settled into David like seeds finding fertile ground. For the first time since the wedding, he felt something beyond despair, a tentative curiosity about who he might become. The next morning, David entered his home office with purpose for the first time in weeks. He'd spent too many days circling the same painful thoughts. Today would be different. He started with his resume, untouched for years, 32 years in financial management, board positions with 3 nonprofits, treasurer for the Community Foundation. professional achievements he'd set aside mentally as he'd focused on being Rachel's dad. He pulled out the community service award he'd received 5 years ago for establishing a scholarship program at the local community college. The citation praised his vision in creating opportunities for non-traditional students. He'd barely registered the accolade at the time, too focused on Rachel's college graduation that same weekend. David opened his laptop and logged into his retirement account. The numbers were solid. He'd always been prudent with his own finances, even while being generous with Rachel. He could retire now if he chose, or work another decade. The freedom of options stretched before him. His phone rang, a colleague from the Community Foundation Board. "David, we've missed you at meetings." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Charles," he replied, surprising himself with how true it felt in this moment. "Just dealing with some personal matters." "Well, we could use your financial expertise on this new youth center project. Any chance you'd be willing to chair the funding committee?" David hesitated only briefly. "Yes, I'd like that." After hanging up, he found himself standing straighter. For weeks he'd been a man hollowed by rejection. Now he began to see the outlines of something new, a life not defined by what he'd lost, but by what he could still create. He glanced at the trust fund documents on his desk. The clause that had allowed him to freeze Rachel's access now seemed like more than just protection. It was possibility. Those resources could do more than provide a comfortable life for a daughter who saw him as an ATM. They could create something meaningful. The kernel of an idea formed as he reviewed his financial expertise, his community connections, his new understanding of parental rejection. What if his pain could become purpose? What if Rachel's betrayal could be transformed into a legacy that helped others? The idea felt too fragile to fully articulate yet, but for the first time since the wedding, David felt a spark of genuine hope. That evening, David spread blank paper across his desk, pen in hand. At the top he wrote, "Overlooked Fathers Foundation." Below, he began listing concepts and possibilities. Support for fathers alienated from their children, legal assistance for adoption rights community building for isolated fathers, educational resources for strengthening father-child bonds, research on parental alienation. The idea had crystallized during his afternoon walk: transform the frozen trust fund into seed money for a foundation supporting fathers who felt invisible, overlooked, or deliberately excluded from their children's lives. His professional background provided the financial expertise. His personal experience offered the emotional understanding. David called Eleanor Harrington, unable to wait until morning. "I need to redirect Rachel's trust fund permanently," he explained, after apologizing for the evening call. "I want to establish a foundation." "That's within your rights under the clause," Eleanor confirmed. "What kind of foundation?" As David outlined his concept, his voice grew stronger, more confident. "This isn't about punishing Rachel," he clarified. "It's about creating meaning from this experience, helping other fathers who feel erased from their children's lives." "It's a powerful concept," Eleanor said. "I know several colleagues who might be interested in serving on your board. Let me make some calls tomorrow." After hanging up, David continued refining the concept, energy flowing through him that he hadn't felt in months. By midnight, he had drafted a mission statement, outlined initial programs, and sketched a structure for the organization. The trust fund that had once represented Rachel's future would now support fathers fighting to remain present in their children's lives. He paused, wondering briefly if this decision would permanently sever any chance of reconciliation with Rachel. But the thought didn't paralyze him as it once might have. Their relationship could only heal if built on mutual respect, not financial dependency. David closed his laptop and walked through the house, turning on lights in rooms that had remained dark for too long. Tomorrow, he would call a locksmith to replace the temporary locks with permanent ones, a small but symbolic act of establishing new boundaries. At his front door, he paused, looking out at the night sky. Stars glimmered in the darkness, points of light creating new constellations. He could almost see the pattern of his future taking shape, different from what he'd imagined, but perhaps equally meaningful. For the first time since being turned away from the wedding, David felt truly present in his own life, not just as Rachel's father, but as a man with purpose, with value, with dignity reclaimed. Thank you for approving Chapter 5. I'll now create Chapter 6 according to your specifications. The first text arrived 3 days after David redirected the trust fund. Dad, we need to talk about the trust. The house closing is next week. David read the message twice, noting the return to Dad rather than David. He set the phone down without responding and continued reviewing foundation documents. 2 hours later, his phone rang. Rachel's number. He let it go to voicemail. Dad, please call me back. There's been some issue with the trust fund. We really need this money for the house. Call me when you get this. By evening, the tone had shifted. 3 missed calls and another text. I don't understand what's happening. We're going to lose our deposit if we can't access the trust. Please call me. David maintained his silence, though each message tugged at paternal instincts that hadn't fully disappeared despite her betrayal. The trust fund paperwork sat on his desk, official notification that the assets had been successfully redirected to establish the overlooked father's foundation. The next day brought escalation, a call from Michael, Rachel's husband. Sir, I know things have been difficult between you and Rachel, but we're in a real bind with this house. Maybe we could meet and discuss. David ended the call mid-sentence. By the weekend, Emily had joined the campaign. Her voicemail dripped with familiar manipulation. David, this childish revenge over a simple wedding oversight is beneath you. Rachel is devastated, and you're punishing her over nothing. A real father would never... Delete. On day 5, Rachel's approach changed. Dad, I'm really sorry about the wedding. I know I hurt you. Please, can we just talk? David's finger hovered over the reply button. Was this genuine remorse or financial desperation? The timing suggested the latter. The final message arrived a week after the first. I guess money meant more to you than our relationship. Good to know where I stand. David placed his phone face down. The irony of her accusation wasn't lost on him, she who had valued his checkbook over his presence at her wedding. Yet the silence he maintained wasn't about revenge, but boundaries. For the first time in their relationship, he wasn't rushing to smooth things over, to make it easy for her to take without giving. His silence spoke volumes that words never could. The paperwork is finalized, Eleanor announced, sliding a document across the conference table. The Overlooked Fathers Foundation is officially incorporated as a 501c3 nonprofit organization. David smiled at the small group gathered for this milestone. Eleanor, Walter, James Harrison, who had surprised David by asking to be involved, and Dr. Caroline Wheeler, a family therapist specializing in parental alienation. Now comes the real work, David said, defining our programs and reaching those who need help. I've drafted some initial ideas, James offered, distributing folders to the group. Based on my research, we should focus on 3 areas: legal support, emotional resources, and community building. Dr. Wheeler nodded. Isolation is one of the most devastating aspects of being separated from your children. Creating community could be as important as practical help. "What about a support group model?" Walter suggested. "Regular meetings where fathers can share experiences and strategies." "Excellent idea," David said. "We could host the first meeting at the community center." They discussed logistics, meeting spaces, website development, outreach strategies, with growing enthusiasm. The foundation was taking shape not just as a legal entity, but as a living community. "We should consider how to handle potential reconciliation situations," Dr. Wheeler noted. "Some fathers will reconnect with their children." An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. David felt their eyes on him. "The foundation isn't about preventing reconciliation," he said carefully. "It's about supporting fathers through separation and helping them maintain dignity and purpose regardless of outcome." James cleared his throat. "Speaking of purpose, I've been in contact with a journalist from the City Tribune. She's interested in covering the foundation launch, especially given the unique circumstances of its creation. A human interest story could help reach fathers who need support," Eleanor observed. "Are you comfortable with that, David?" Walter asked. "It would mean sharing some of your personal story." David considered the question. Privacy had been his instinct throughout the ordeal with Rachel, but perhaps his experience could help others feel less alone. "Yes," he decided. "If it helps other fathers, I'm willing to share my story." As the meeting adjourned, David felt a profound sense of purpose. The room hummed with shared vision and commitment, a stark contrast to the isolation he'd experienced after the wedding rejection. From exclusion had emerged inclusion. From rejection, connection. The community center meeting room filled slowly. David had arranged chairs in a circle, a deliberate choice to emphasize equality and shared experience. He fidgeted with his notes, wondering if anyone would actually come. Walter arrived first, offering silent support with his presence. Then others began to trickle in, men of various ages and backgrounds, united by the hesitant look of those uncertain they belong. "Welcome," David began once everyone was seated. "Thank you for coming to this first meeting of the Overlooked Fathers Support Group. I'm David Matthews, and like everyone here, I know what it means to be excluded from your child's life." He shared his story briefly, the wedding exclusion, the social media mockery, the journey from devastation to purpose. As he spoke, he saw recognition in their eyes, heads nodding in understanding. "Now I'd like to hear from you," he said, opening the floor. Thomas, a weathered man in his 60s, spoke first. "My daughters haven't spoken to me in 12 years. Their mother convinced them I abandoned the family when she was the one who left." Marcus, younger with a military bearing, shared next. "My ex-wife moved my son across the country. I get FaceTime calls when she remembers, which isn't often." One by one they shared, stepfathers pushed aside, adoptive fathers like David, whose contributions were minimized, divorced dads fighting parental alienation. Different circumstances, same pain. "Sometimes I wonder if I even matter anymore," admitted Eduardo, a soft-spoken man who hadn't seen his teenage daughters in 3 years. "Like I was just a wallet or a babysitter, not a father." "You matter," David said firmly. "We all do. That's why we're here, to remind each other of that truth when it's hard to believe." The conversation flowed more easily after that, moving from pain to practical strategies, from isolation to connection. By the meeting's end, phone numbers had been exchanged, and tentative smiles replaced the guarded expressions from 2 hours earlier. As the men filtered out, a woman approached David, petite with determined eyes and a press badge. "Mr. Matthews, I'm Sophia Chen from the City Tribune. James Harrison mentioned your foundation. I'd love to interview you for a feature on overlooked fathers." "Of course," David agreed. "This story needs to be told." I'll need photographs for the article, she added. Would tomorrow work for a proper interview and photo session at the foundation office? He nodded, unaware that within days his face would grace the Sunday features section, and that the article would find its way to Rachel's breakfast table, changing everything once again. Thank you for approving Chapter 6. I'll now create Chapter 7 according to your specifications. Sunday morning found David reviewing foundation materials at his kitchen table, coffee in hand. The City Tribune feature had run that morning, a full-page spread with his photograph and the headline, "From Personal Pain to Public Purpose, Local Man Founds Support Network for Overlooked Fathers." The doorbell's chime startled him. He wasn't expecting visitors, especially not at 9 on a Sunday morning. Through the peephole he saw Rachel, alone, shifting nervously from foot to foot. His pulse quickened. After a moment's hesitation, he opened the door, but remained in the threshold, neither inviting her in nor sending her away. "Rachel." His tone was neutral, carefully controlled. "Dad." Her eyes were red-rimmed, the newspaper clutched in her hand. "I saw the article." He waited, silent. Let her speak first. "Can I come in, please?" David stepped aside, allowing her to enter, but leading her only as far as the entryway. The symbolic boundary was clear. She wasn't being welcomed back fully, not yet. "I didn't know," she said, holding up the newspaper. "About the foundation." "About what it meant to you, being excluded from the wedding." "What did you think it meant?" David asked quietly. Rachel's composure cracked. "Mom said you wouldn't care, that you were only ever interested in the financial part of being a father, that adoptive fathers don't feel the same way." "And you believed that?" "I don't know what I believed." Tears welled in her eyes. "I let her convince me that it would be simpler, cleaner, that you'd write the checks and understand. Then, when you froze the trust, you assumed I was being vindictive," David finished. She nodded, ashamed. "It wasn't until I saw this," she tapped the newspaper, "that I understood. James called me yesterday. He told me everything about confronting Mom at the wedding, about his involvement with your foundation." "James has been surprisingly supportive," David acknowledged. "He said I needed to see what real integrity looks like." Rachel looked directly at him now. "Dad, I'm so sorry. What I did was cruel and thoughtless. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I needed you to know that I understand now what I threw away." The apology seemed genuine, but David had learned caution. "And the trust fund? Is that part of why you're here?" Rachel flinched, but answered honestly. "At first, when it was frozen, that was all I cared about. But seeing this article, learning you've redirected it to help others, I realize some things can't be fixed with money. Some betrayals go deeper." For the first time since the wedding, David saw a glimmer of the daughter he'd raised, capable of self-reflection, of growth. But the bridge between them remained fragile, barely beginning to rebuild. They moved to the living room, a small concession, but significant. Rachel sat on the edge of the sofa while David took the armchair opposite, maintaining physical and emotional distance. "The house fell through," Rachel offered. "We lost the deposit." "I'm sorry about that," David said, meaning it despite everything. "What will you do now?" "Michael and I are looking at apartments." She hesitated. "It's been a wake-up call, honestly, living within our means instead of counting on the trust fund. That may not be a bad thing." "No," she agreed quietly, "it isn't. Neither is having to actually work on my marriage instead of just focusing on the wedding and the house." David raised an eyebrow, questioning. "Things with Michael have been strained," Rachel admitted. He was angry about losing the trust fund at first, but then he started asking questions about why you would do something so drastic. It made us both confront some uncomfortable truths. Such as? That I've treated you as an ATM, not a father. Her voice broke slightly. That I allowed Mom to manipulate my feelings about you for years. That I've never properly appreciated everything you did as my dad. David absorbed her words, measuring their sincerity. Thank you for saying that. Is there any way to fix this? Rachel asked, vulnerability plain on her face. To undo what I've done? Some things can't be undone, David said gently but firmly. The trust fund has been legally redirected. That decision is permanent. I don't mean the money, she clarified quickly. I mean us, our relationship. David considered her question carefully. Relationships can heal, but they don't return to exactly what they were. They transform into something new, hopefully something healthier. What would that look like for us? Mutual respect, clear boundaries, genuine connection, not obligation or transaction. He paused. I'll always be your father, Rachel. That hasn't changed, but how we relate to each other needs to change. I understand, she said, and for perhaps the first time, she truly seemed to. I don't expect things to be fixed in one conversation. Good, because they won't be. His tone was kind, but unwavering. Trust rebuilds slowly. I need to see consistent respect and understanding, not just hear about it once when you're feeling emotional. Rachel nodded, accepting the boundary without protest. Another small sign of growth. So where do we start? With honesty, with listening to each other, with time. David offered a tentative smile. And perhaps with you learning more about the foundation, understanding why it matters to me. The path forward wasn't clear or certain, but it existed, a possibility neither had imagined a few hours earlier. The foundation office hummed with activity when David arrived on Monday morning. The Tribune article had generated a surge of interest, emails, phone calls, donations. James was already there, organizing the responses with unexpected efficiency. Morning, David, he greeted warmly. Quite a response to the article. I'm a bit overwhelmed, David admitted. In a good way, I hope. James handed him a coffee. I've sorted the messages into categories: potential board members, volunteers, fathers seeking support, and donors. David accepted the coffee gratefully. You've become quite invested in this foundation. It matters, James said simply. What happened to you, what Rachel and Emily did, it affected me deeply, made me question what kind of family we were creating through Michael and Rachel's marriage. And yet, you're helping build something positive from that situation. That's what drew me to the foundation, James said. You could have responded with bitterness, with vindictiveness. Instead, you created something that helps others. That's the kind of man I want to be associated with. David smiled. I never expected my daughter's father-in-law to become my closest ally. Life takes unexpected turns. James hesitated. Speaking of which, Rachel called me yesterday after seeing you. Did she? David tried to keep his tone neutral. She was quite moved by your conversation. Said you were firm but fair. James looked thoughtful. She asked me if I thought she could attend the Foundation's launch event next month. The request surprised David. What did you tell her? That it wasn't my decision to make. James met David's gaze. But personally, I think it could be a positive step. for her to see this world you've created, to understand the impact of the foundation, to witness your leadership. David considered the suggestion. A month ago, the idea of Rachel at a foundation event would have seemed impossible. Now it felt complicated, not unwelcome, but significant. "Not as family," David said finally. "Not yet. But as someone who might learn something from the experience, yes, I think that could work." James nodded. "I'll let her know." As they turned to the day's tasks, David reflected on the unexpected alliance that had formed. James, a stranger 3 months ago, had become a partner in building something meaningful. And Rachel, who had deliberately excluded him from her wedding, might now witness the purpose he had found in that exclusion. The irony wasn't lost on him. From the ashes of rejection had risen not only personal renewal, but new connections, unexpected alliances, bridges not burned, but carefully maintained, waiting for the possibility of something new to cross them. "The launch event is on the 15th, David said. "Tell Rachel she's welcome to attend, not as my daughter, but as someone who might benefit from understanding what we're doing here." In that invitation lay both boundary and opportunity, justice tempered with mercy, exactly as the foundation itself embodied. "Thank you for approving Chapter 7. I'll now create the reflective ending according to your specifications." The foundation launch event transformed the community center's modest ballroom. Nearly 100 people filled the space, fathers sharing stories of separation and hope, community leaders offering support, media capturing the unexpected movement growing from one man's pain. David stood at the edge of the room, observing. 3 months ago, he'd been barred from his daughter's wedding. Tonight, he'd created a home for the excluded, a community for the overlooked. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. His gaze found Rachel, standing quietly at the back of the room. She'd arrived without fanfare, listened intently to the speakers, observed the connections forming among the fathers. She hadn't approached him yet, respecting the boundaries they'd established. That alone showed growth. Walter appeared at his side. "Quite a turnout." "More than I expected," David admitted. "Pain shared becomes pain transformed," Walter said. "You've created something meaningful here." David nodded, watching a young father embrace an older man after sharing stories. "I've learned that dignity isn't something others can take from you, only something you can surrender or reclaim." The journey from devastation to purpose hadn't been linear. Each step, from the wedding rejection to the trust fund clause, from identity crisis to foundation creation, had built upon the last, a path emerging only in retrospect. The greatest wound can become the most unexpected gift, David reflected, not because the injury itself was good, but because how we respond to rejection shapes who we become. Across the room, James caught his eye and nodded respectfully. Another unexpected alliance born from conflict. The foundation they'd built together would support fathers long after the personal pain had faded. David understood now that fatherhood transcended biological ties, legal documentation, and even reciprocal affection. It was a commitment to nurture and protect, whether recognized or not. The test came not when love flowed easily, but when it required boundaries and wisdom. The path with Rachel remained uncertain. Some bridges, once damaged, take years to rebuild. But tonight had shown that even from ashes, something new and meaningful could emerge. Not a replacement for what was lost, but a transformation that honored the journey through pain to purpose.